We, as the English Collective of Prostitutes, have had a long-standing working relationship with the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, who lobbied very successfully for that bill. And I'm really delighted to welcome Tim Barnett here down at Tent City University, on both fronts actually. We're delighted to have Tim Barnett with us, and we're delighted to be down at Tent City University. I can't think of a better place to have our meeting. And as sex workers, we've been part of Occupy right from the very beginning, and we've really found a home here among the rest of the 99%, so we're glad to host our meeting here. Tim Barnett, as you may have seen from the publicity, is a former New Zealand MP who sponsored the 2003 Prostitution Reform Act in New Zealand, which introduced decriminalisation. And he's going to speak about how that law was won and the impact so far.
Thanks a lot, Nikki. It's really wonderful and special to be here this evening. This tent city from where I now live in South Africa, where I'm working on sex worker rights and decriminalisation. This tent city has become an icon for plain speaking, for saying the things which the media and politicians are often too afraid or too embarrassed to voice. And it's really great to be here this evening to talk about an issue which is indeed a bit of a challenge to established thinking and to our power system. And I'm going to talk tonight about a human right which is personal, indeed intimate, and which is denied by the law in this and virtually every other country. And that's the right for consenting adults to have sexual contact with each other. It's pretty simple. I'm going to go through that again. Adults, we're talking about people over 18. We're talking about genuine consent, where both people are willingly entering into the relationship, and we're talking about sexual contact. If you ask 100 people if that should be a right, regardless of race or gender or anything else, I think pretty near to that 99 out of 100 would say yes. If you ask if sex work should be decriminalised, you probably wouldn't get to 99, but in fact that's the same thing. That's what decriminalisation is all about. Adults consenting, having sexual contact with each other. Working now in the environment of South Africa, where the law has not only banned people of the same gender having sexual contact, but also banned people of the same race having sexual contact. In recent memory and recent experience, that's a reality, and this to me is the last boundary that we have to cross in that respect. And it's only 0.5% of countries which have managed to do that. One country has actually changed the law to do that, and that's little old New Zealand, as far away as you can possibly get from here tonight. Now, law that makes sex workers into criminals is driven by forces which are really familiar to people who are students of this tent city university. It's driven by the greed of those business people who profit from prohibition. And those of you who know about prohibition of other products and activities know that prohibition usually leads to an awful lot of people making money on the side. It's driven by fundamentalist religious moralizing, the same mindset which has terrorized women and minorities through history. It's driven by governments who falsely believe that they know what is best for women. And it's driven by ideologies who fail to think through the implications of putting a warped theory into practice. And because in many countries in different ways criminalisation of sex work is enforced, and because poor women and particularly women of colour bear the brunt of criminalisation, because laws which ban sex work are virtually unenforceable and therefore become an invitation for the police to take into their own hands their form of punishment on sex workers and on sex work businesses. This becomes a significant moral issue of our time. I'm going to very, very briefly, in the few minutes I have left, tell you what happened in New Zealand, first of all say what the law actually contains, then how it happened, and then the effect of that law. There are broadly 4 different ways you can design law around sex work. If you can imagine, if I had a visual here, 2 little stick people, one's a client and one's a sex worker. Under criminalisation, such as we have in South Africa, such as in the UK, put a red cross over both of them. They're both breaking the law. If you have a partial criminalisation, then such as you have in Sweden, other Scandinavian countries, put a red cross over the client, so the client is breaking the law, but the sex worker isn't. The problem with that is guilt by association. The sex worker's activities get pushed underground. The third model is regulation or legalisation. Happens in some European countries, parts of Australia, and you can put a question mark over both those stick figures because the state has all sorts of rules that surround sex work, where it can happen, the size of brothels, registration of sex workers and so forth. So there are still workers breaking the law even though they're adults and they're consenting and they have sexual contact together. And then the fourth model is decriminalisation, where you put a tick over both those figures, because as long as the activity is in private and it's consenting and it's adult, then it's okay. And that's the law which we introduced into New Zealand. We did basically 3 things. We introduced new laws which, for example, gave sex workers the right to access to health and safety, so that brothels had to actually operate like any other businesses within the law, treating people fairly. We put obligations around safer sex for the owners of businesses and for the clients of sex work. And we also gave sex workers protection to break the effective contract they had with the client if the client's behaviour was getting threatening. So those are the new laws. And then, thank you. And then secondly, we removed laws which criminalised consensual activity or being associated with sex work. And then we strengthened the laws which are about genuine harms, because there are harms associated with sex work. So being coerced into sex work, being coerced to stay in sex work, being a client, having sex with a sex worker aged under 18, and so forth. There were new strengthened laws in that area. So those are the genuine crimes, the genuine victims, which we dealt with more toughly. But the action of the sex worker and the client, the consensual activity, was not illegal. And at the same time, we happened to pass clean slate law that meant that anyone who had a conviction for prostitution could get that conviction wiped, so it was off their record forever. And that basically was a package. It's pretty simple law, pretty straightforward and pretty logical. Second question is how it was won. It was won over a long time. It was won by a pretty obvious collection of groupings. It would include, I suspect, the kind of groups in New Zealand equivalent to the groups that you here are part of. It was the Labour Party, the Green Party, and oddly enough the Libertarians on the kind of far right economically, but for personal freedom, and we formed a pretty unholy alliance to get it through. Most women's groups supported us, particularly the more traditional church-based women's groups tended to be in favour. Public health groups, human rights groups, and others. As you can imagine, a progressive force coming together. And we basically did that by a process of persuasion of my colleagues to get it in our party's manifesto. We got it in the Green Party manifesto as well. My colleagues were a little nervous about it being a government piece of legislation, so I said I was happy to put it forward as my piece of legislation, working all the time, as Nikki said, with the Prostitutes Collective, because all the public activity has to really be fronted by sex workers.